Prior to the Civil War, Baltimore was a very bloodthirsty and just nasty, nasty place to be. The Plug Uglies are a nativist American club that forms in the mid-1850s over on the west side of Baltimore. They tend to ally themselves with the American Party, which is an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant party. George Konig is probably the first neighborhood boss Baltimore had ever had. He gets arrested for stealing silk handkerchiefs. He gets convicted. He's sentenced to 12 years in the penitentiary. When he enters the penitentiary, he's already scarred all over the place, so he's already had some running battles. He uses his political powers and his savvy to get out of the penitentiary. He's essentially pardoned. He meets a wife, moves here to Fells Point, and he lives in the heart of the most infamous neighborhood in Baltimore history, which is the Causeway. The Causeway is Eastern Avenue from Broadway to pretty much Central.
Yeah, this is definitely an example of what the Causeway would have looked like. These houses, again, a little bit smaller than what you would find down, say, Bond Street.
It used to be a heavily swampy area, almost waterfront property. The road was essentially like a causeway.
Okay.
Houses would sink.
Okay.
It was the lowest of the low, and it was close right here to the docks. Your captains, your first mates would be drinking down here on Thames Street, and the stevedores, the draymen, the lower level sailors would make their way up to the Causeway. And the Causeway was essentially whorehouse, 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 whorehouse. And George and his wife ran a whorehouse.
His house would have been on the north side of the street, right there close to Spring Street.
Okay.
Now, his rival, James Manley, who was the chief fighting man of the American club, the Roughskins. The Roughskin Hall was directly across the street from him, as well as James Manley's whorehouse. So you had two rival whorehouses, Konig's whorehouse, Manley's whorehouse, and they're looking across the street at each other every day.
He's not even really that bad yet. He gets convicted again. He gets convicted of stealing during a fire, and he goes off for 2 more years. And when he leaves after the 2 years, he is a different man. He's tattooed all over the place, and he has just more and more scars, and you can see a definite shift in his attitude and things that he starts to do upon getting out. He becomes the bastard of Fells Point, as the Baltimore Sun liked to refer to him.
And what did he do?
He just started to exert his power. He was a fighting man, so he was constantly involved in the running battles for the Democratic Party, and he established Fells Point and City Dock area and the Causeway as a Democratic stronghold. The Roughskins and the Plug Uglies, the regulators from downtown, all American Party gangs would come down to Fells Point and pick on the immigrants, and he was the only one to stand up to them. So he becomes kind of a legend down here. He is shot all the time. He is constantly being shot, stabbed. He was hit in the head with an axe, and he always survives. It's interesting when you're reading old newspaper accounts about him. During the first half of the 1850s, it's a man was shot in the chest and is going to die. And then later on an update, he doesn't die. And then there's George Konig was shot again. Chances are he'll die over the next 2 days. Midway through the 1850s, George Konig was shot again. He's going to survive. Lesser men would die, but not George. He's going to live. And that's pretty much what happens. I mean, you couldn't kill the man. He starts to run the waterfront. He's involved in labor disputes. He is heavily involved in contraband running. There is some note of him being a Shanghaier. There was one nickname that was Shanghai Town down here in Fells Point.
Wow.
It's called crimping here.
Crimping.
Crimping.
Okay.
And it was legal, technically. He was essentially a mafia boss of the neighborhood. And if the American Party was down here causing trouble, he was the first to tell them to stop. Often he got his butt whooped, but he was always there to stand up and fight for the neighborhood. He becomes an ardent Democrat, and he's a Southern Democrat. He believes in slavery. Some people say he's the cause of the Pratt Street riot. Pratt Street riot is the first death of the Civil War. It's a riot that occurs when federal troops were going to protect Washington after the bombardment of Fort Sumter. There was a law in Baltimore that you couldn't run the train directly through the city. So the trains had to go into President Street Station here on the end of Fells Point. And yes, it's Fells Point, not Harbor East. Those train cars would then have to be pulled by horse to Camden Yards to Washington, D.C. George and the double pumps did not want this to happen, and they started to lay plans to stop it. It becomes the first death of the Civil War. It takes a very hardened person to attack federal troops. And the only people that would do that would be these firemen that did this for fun every single day. He's charged with treason. Miraculously, he escaped that as well. During the Civil War, he, as a runner, a blockade runner, he's charged with treason again for running contraband down to Southern troops. He starts to calm down after the Civil War. He's shot a couple more times.
Okay, so I have to ask, how did he die?
George died an old man.
He died an old man.
With a city job. If you put in enough work, you get rewarded. Konig was rewarded with becoming a bridge keeper here in Fells Point. His son becomes a U.S. congressman. His grandson becomes a city councilman. He, through sheer will and violence, established his family and did pretty well with it.